A lot of people will prepare for the CQA exam by trying to understand the different audit types or definitions or the different steps of an audit. And those are really important, and they will be on the exam, by the way. But equally important is understanding how auditors think and how they'll react in scenarios, because we found time and again that an area that students really struggle in is how to handle those scenarios. In this video, I wanted to step away from the pure exam preparation and share 5 practical lessons that I've learned working in the back room and front room of audits where I'm being audited, or actually being the auditor. They really help with understanding dealing with different scenarios and how that comes up on the exam. And if you are preparing for the CQA, check out the video that we have on how to pass the CQA on the very first try, because it goes through the framework that Andy and I developed for how to help students pass the exam. So you should get everything you need, at least conceptually and philosophically there. Now let's jump into the episode. Let's kick things off with lesson number 1, which is that audits look at things from a system perspective, and they're not looking at you specifically as a person. I used to think of an audit as if it was an X-ray of Subhi's work. Somebody is coming in to look at me specifically, and they're evaluating Subhi's work specifically, and that if I do poorly, whether it's the work that I did on evidence that's being reviewed, or in the way that I present that evidence, that they're going to meet me with a box outside of the door and say, Subhi, don't even bother, just grab your stuff and get out of here. And I kind of came to realize that audits are in place to get a peek behind the curtain and just understand, is your system suitable, effective, and adequate? Do you need to add more resources? Are there particular areas that you have choke points, bottlenecks, areas that are an issue? And they're a really important part when it comes to due diligence or proving that you're as good as you say you are. So if I want to do work with a company that says that they're qualified to be able to do a certain kind of important, critical, or regulated work, I should be able to spend a day looking at their facilities and come out of it feeling comfortable. So it's not the root canal that I used to think it was as I've matured, and I've started to appreciate it more and more as I've become an auditor. And I think it's an important part of an auditor's job to be able to diffuse, lower the temperature, make it more chill, make it more relaxed, because that's how you're going to be able to get to whether or not the system is adequate. Because a company commissioned you to go and do an evaluation, and you come back because all you did was ruffle feathers and you say they suck, and it was actually you that just caused everybody to be anxious and not show you things well, then, it's a waste of time, energy, money, and you may kill a project or put it on its knees because, you were too much of a jerk in an audit, or you didn't realize that most of the people going into the room are afraid. Once you understand that an audit is looking at things from a systems perspective, you start to avoid certain things. And when I was a young and more green auditor, wet behind the ears, I would think that getting my magnifying glass and finding really detailed onesie, twosie, you didn't cross your T's, you didn't dot your I's kind of issues were worthwhile. But lesson number 2 is to look for patterns and not one-off instances. The caveat being that sometimes there are things that are critical that even if they happen one time, it's really an issue. But in most cases, look for patterns, multiple instances, or things that are systemic. People make mistakes because people are human, and mistakes are going to happen. Your point as an auditor is not to look at typos or issues. It's really the gravity of the mistake and whether or not the mistake violated an internal or external rule. So if you have a typo, is it a mistake? Yeah, of course it's a mistake. Is it meaningful enough where you would actually document it if it's very clear what the intent was, there was just a slip of the keyboard? No. If you have a procedure that says you do steps 1, 2, and 3, and you see in one case, one employee didn't do step 2, you may have a minor finding if it's not like a really critical step. If you found that every employee was skipping step 2, that's a big finding, right? And so your job as an auditor is not to shine a light on a specific person who made a single mistake. It's more to look for special cause variation where there's something that's causing the issue and things that are systemic, where there's a problem that can be addressed by a process, procedure, resources, etc. Not, onesie twosie typos, because that's always going to happen. But, it's like in Arabic, we say a hair on a hair becomes a beard. So you may have a bunch of little mistakes, but if it's everywhere, then you don't know. Like if for example, you're looking at a batch record and somebody made a typo on one number and it's very clear what the number was, you may highlight it because a batch record is really important. But if all the numbers are all over the place, then you don't know which one is right or wrong. And that's where we talk about in the exam day guide, where when you're looking at observations, findings, areas of improvement, you look at the criticality of what the issue is and how prevalent it is, and whether or not it actually violated a written requirement that was part of your audit standards. But finding the right issues is really dependent on what you decide to look at, and that's all based on the scope that you set for the audit. So lesson number 3 is to set a not only clear, but a realistic scope that you can actually accomplish in the time amount of auditors that you have assigned in terms of resources. One of the biggest mistakes auditors can make is casting too wide of a scope and not assigning the appropriate strategy with that scope. So most organizations have an expectation that you're not auditing in a vacuum, especially if you're bringing in an auditor from the outside, because you have somebody who's commissioning you to do the audit. You're not the one who's setting that objective. It's coming from external. The issue that can happen is there's a mismatch between the amount of time and the amount of resources that you have to do the audit and what they think they want or what they think they need to get that objective. So you may be in a place where they give you every standard under the sun. And audit teams, unfortunately, where at the first pass, you're looking at it like, if I were to try and do what's on this initial draft, it's going to take me 3 to 5 auditors in like a week because you want me to look at everything. It's important to set what are really the important foundational audit standards that you're looking towards and what is the purpose of the objective of the audit. And so there's a massive difference between, we need to look at this organization in general against 8 standards versus this organization is going to be doing assembly activity for pre-filled syringes where we're giving them the syringes and they need to meet XYZ specific standards, because then you can go into those standards and look in, well, which of those apply, which sections apply the most, and then you just rank order them. And then you can develop a really thoughtful audit agenda. And so one of the biggest mistakes auditors can make is not scrutinizing the early inputs into an audit agenda, because everything else is downstream. And on the back end, an audit agenda can be thought of like a grocery list. If you don't come back with the tomatoes, you got to explain why you didn't look at that thing. And usually, I didn't have enough time is not a good enough reason, because you knew how much time you were going to spend in the audit. You knew that you were going to be there for a day and a half or 2 days or 1 day. So, and this is not your first audit. So why didn't you plan effectively, right? You end up holding the bag, and it's not always like the end of the world, but it can cause a lot of heartache if somebody really wanted you to look at a thing that you didn't look at. Even if you have the audit scope fully planned out and you understand what you need to look at, just being technical isn't enough to be a good auditor. And the 4th lesson is that audit is a skill set in its own right, and that just because you're technical doesn't mean that you have all of the necessary skills to be a good auditor. I think one thing that separates an amazing auditor from an average auditor, okay, I was speaking at a PDA conference last year, and a guy walked up to the mic, and a PDA is kind of like a technical forum, and he was a little bit up in arms because Some of the audits that he had seen weren't super high value from his perspective. And he was just like, shouldn't really technical people be the ones who are doing audits? And I was just like, well, that's an interesting question. Should technical people be doing audits? I think the answer is yes, so long as they have the audit skill sets. So one of the things that separates amazing auditors from average auditors is that they not only have a technical background, but they also have the tools, tactics, strategies, and experience to audit as a skill. Technical is a skill, audit is a skill. You can apply technical into audit, but it doesn't necessarily, it's not a full carryover. It's not one to one. One of them's basketball, one of them is hockey, let's say. And so the amazing auditors not only focus on, having the good technical background, but they understand audit strategies, audit tactics, audit process, because that's really important. And also, just as an aside, companies have to demonstrate how they qualify their auditors. So it's not enough to just have a technical background. Most, especially large organizations, because audit is used as a filter for separating good and bad decisions, who you're using to do the audit is an important criteria. So many organizations will mandate specific requirements, and then even if you have a lot of audit experience, they'll still have you audit under supervision before they give you the full okay to go audit on your own. Amazing auditors combine the amazing auditors have the respect for the technical as well as the tactics. And the final lesson is that when you lower the temperature as an auditor, you tend to get much better audit results. I think one thing that I wish auditors, one thing that I think is sometimes lost, especially because auditors, it's kind of like rinse and repeat if that's your full-time role, is like for some people, the amount of anxiety that's balled up in an audit is just so high that with people who are more junior, just giving them the comfort to be able to like settle in, lower the temperature, lower the anxiety can have truly such a big impact. Like I'll never forget one of my first audits ever was maybe 3 years in my career. And my project, the one that I was the quality lead for, was being looked at in quite a bit of detail. My boss was the host of the audit. The host means you have an auditor who's there to look at your work, and your host is your first line of defense. And so they're the ones who say, "Oh, Subhi, if you're falling off the deep end," they'll say, "All right, we're going to stop for now. We're going to regroup, and then we'll bring Subhi back in a little while. I think there's another document that we need to bring in." So that's their role. They start talking about my project. My boss walks out, and I'm like, "What the heck am I supposed to do? This is my project. There's no training wheels." And so he comes back in a little while later, and after that audit day was over, I was just like, "Hey, why did you leave me on my own?" And he was just like, "Oh, I got a message that in the other audit room, this one guy was really struggling with a document, and I saw you start, and I'm like, there's nothing to worry about here." And so that experience, just that little interaction, it was my defense of the document was probably 15 minutes. I think about that every single audit that I'm part of because of how much downstream confidence it gave me. You can have a significant impact on how people think of themselves. And the difference between how a person who's being audited shows up is largely in the way that you can ask a question. So actually in the exam day guide, we go through the different interview techniques, and there are 5 interview techniques that are described, and they actually this is a good segue. We talk about interview techniques and how to get people to settle in, settle down, because they're otherwise they're going to clam up. It's the number one topic on the CQA exam from a density pound, pound for pound. It's the single smallest chapter with the most amount of questions on the CQA exam because of how important it is in terms of how you execute an audit. So I wish people would give that the respect it deserves. Somebody's first or second or third time, those are really, really impactful on them. So sometimes it's important. Sometimes you need to be assertive to get what you need, because on the other side, like, you need to be able to show your, I've been in situations before where you make a repeated request over and over again, and they're just not giving it to you. And in those cases, you really have to be assertive, because your whoever commissioned you to do the audit is expecting you to get the audit result. And sometimes it's out of your hands. Sometimes they claim whatever it is proprietary, even though it's not. But in most cases, it's easier to catch flies with honey than it is with vinegar. If you are preparing for the CQA, check out the video that we have on how to pass the CQA on the very first try, because it goes through the framework that Andy and I developed for how to help students pass the exam. So you should get everything you need, at least conceptually and philosophically, there.